The first time Ethan saw Javier, his breath caught like a fishhook snagged in his throat. It was a humid August evening in Brooklyn, the kind where the air clung to your skin like a second shirt, and Javier was lifting crates at the community garden, muscles rippling under his sweat-soaked tank top. Ethan, 28, an aspiring playwright with a penchant for overthinking, froze mid-step, his notebook slipping from his hands. He'd come to the garden to find inspiration for his next script, something to capture the raw pulse of New York City. Instead, he found Javier, 30, a landscaper with a smile that could stop traffic and arms that looked carved from oak. Ethan wasn't the type to stare, usually, but Javier's presence demanded it, like a spotlight on a stage. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Ethan felt his world tilt. "You okay there?" Javier called, his voice warm with a faint Puerto Rican accent, as he set down a crate and wiped his brow. Ethan mumbled something incoherent, scrambling to pick up his notebook, his face burning hotter than the summer sun. The garden was a patchwork of green tucked between graffiti-streaked buildings, a haven where locals grew tomatoes and dreamed side by side. Ethan had been volunteering there for weeks, mostly to escape his cramped apartment and the nagging voice in his head that said his plays would never make it to Broadway. Javier, though, was new, a transplant from San Juan, hired to redesign the garden's layout. His confidence was magnetic, his laugh a melody that seemed to coax even the wilted plants back to life. Ethan, who'd always been cautious, found himself drawn to Javier's orbit, unable to resist the pull. Over the next few days, Ethan found excuses to linger at the garden. He'd weed a row of carrots, steal glances at Javier, and pretend he wasn't memorizing the way his biceps flexed when he hauled bags of soil. Javier noticed, of course. "You're going to wear out those pages staring at me instead of writing," he teased one afternoon, leaning on a shovel with a grin that made Ethan's knees weak. They started talking, small things at first, favorite coffee spots, the best taco truck in Brooklyn, the way the city skyline looked at dusk. But each conversation peeled back layers, revealing Javier's quiet strength and Ethan's hidden vulnerabilities. Javier had grown up in a tight-knit family, but coming out at 18 had fractured those ties. "They love me," he told Ethan one evening, as they sat on a bench sharing a bottle of iced tea, "but they don't get it. I left to find a place where I could be me." Ethan nodded, understanding too well. His own coming out had been a whispered confession to his sister in a diner, followed by years of dodging his parents' disappointed sighs. The shared pain forged a bond, fragile but electric, like a wire sparking in the dark. By the end of the week, Ethan was hooked. He'd always been intense. His exes called him too much for his habit of diving headfirst into feelings. But this was different. Javier wasn't just a crush. He was a fire Ethan couldn't stop reaching for, even if it burned. One night, as they locked up the garden shed, Javier brushed Ethan's arm, his fingers lingering just long enough to send a jolt through Ethan's body. "Your trouble," Javier said, half laughing, but his eyes held something deeper, desire, maybe, or a challenge. Ethan wanted to touch him, to feel the strength beneath Javier's skin, but he held back, terrified of what it might unleash. The obsession grew quietly at first. Ethan started sketching Javier in his notebook, not just his face, but the curve of his shoulders, the veins in his forearms. He'd lie awake at night, replaying their conversations, imagining what it would be like to trace those muscles with his fingers. It wasn't just attraction. It was a hunger, a need to know every part of Javier, to claim him in a way that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. Ethan knew he was spiraling, but he couldn't stop. The garden, once a refuge, became a stage for his longing. Every glance and touch a line in a script he couldn't stop writing. One evening, as rain threatened to break the summer heat, Javier invited Ethan to his apartment for a drink. It was a small, cluttered place in Bed-Stuy, filled with plants and photos of San Juan. They sat on a worn couch, a salsa record spinning softly in the background, and Javier's knee brushed against Ethan's. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" Javier asked, his voice low, teasing but curious. Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to say, "Because you're everything I've ever wanted," but instead, he leaned in, and Javier didn't pull away. Their lips met, tentative at first, then hungry, and Ethan's hands found Javier's arms, fingers digging into the muscle he'd been dreaming of. It was ecstasy, and the start of something he couldn't control. That kiss changed everything. Ethan woke the next morning in Javier's bed, sunlight streaming through a cracked window, the memory of Javier's body pressed against his still vivid. But with the warmth came a shadow, a gnawing fear that this was too good, too fast. Javier, shirtless and brewing coffee, seemed unfazed, his easy smile disarming Ethan's doubts. "You think too much," Javier said, handing him a mug. "Just let this be what it is." But for Ethan, it was already more, a spark that had ignited a wildfire. They fell into a rhythm, meeting at the garden by day and tangled in each other's arms by night. Ethan's notebook filled with scenes inspired by Javier, a love story set against the grid of the city, two men defying the odds. But the more he wrote, the more he fixated on Javier's physicality. It wasn't just love, it was worship. He'd run his hands over Javier's shoulders, tracing every contour, memorizing the way his muscles tensed under his touch. Javier laughed it off at first, flattered, but Ethan could see the flicker of unease in his eyes when the touches lingered too long. The obsession tightened its grip. Ethan started showing up unannounced at Javier's landscaping jobs, claiming he was just passing by. He'd watch from a distance, heart racing at the sight of Javier's strength, his body a canvas of power and grace. At night, he'd ask questions, too many questions, about Javier's past, his body, his routines. "You're intense, man," Javier said one night, half joking, but there was an edge to his voice. Ethan laughed, brushing it off, but inside, he was spiraling. He didn't just want Javier. He needed him, like air, like words on a page. The first crack appeared at a bar in Williamsburg. They were out with Javier's friends, a lively group of artists and musicians. Ethan, usually quiet in crowds, clung to Javier's side, his hand possessive on Javier's arm. When a friend, Marcus, playfully punched Javier's shoulder, Ethan's stomach twisted with jealousy. He drank too much, his words sharp when he snapped at Marcus to back off. Javier pulled him outside, his face tight. "What's going on with you?" he asked. Ethan wanted to confess the storm inside him, but all he managed was, I don't want to lose you." Javier softened, but his eyes held a warning Ethan couldn't ignore. The city, once a backdrop for their romance, started to feel like a pressure cooker. Ethan's writing suffered. His play became a chaotic mess of longing and fear, mirroring his mind. He'd see Javier talking to someone at the garden and imagine betrayals that weren't there. One night, unable to sleep, he scrolled through Javier's Instagram, dissecting every photo, every comment. A picture of Javier at the gym, shirtless and grinning, sent Ethan into a tailspin. He texted Javier at 2 a.m., asking who'd taken the photo. The reply came hours later. "You need to chill, Ethan." But chilling wasn't in Ethan's nature. He started following Javier to the gym, lingering outside, watching through the glass as Javier lifted weights. The sight of him, sweat-slicked, powerful, fed Ethan's obsession but also his insecurity. Javier was everything Ethan wasn't: confident, grounded, whole. What if he realized Ethan wasn't enough? The thought gnawed at him, turning every touch into a desperate plea for reassurance. One evening, at a rooftop party in Bushwick, The tension boiled over. Javier was dancing with a group, his laughter ringing out, and Ethan stood on the sidelines, clutching a beer, his mind racing. When Javier pulled him onto the dance floor, Ethan's hands gripped him too tightly, his eyes searching Javier's face for something, anything, to anchor him. "You're scaring me," Javier whispered, pulling back. The words hit Ethan like a slap. He stumbled off the roof, the city lights blurring through tears, knowing he'd pushed too far, but unsure how to stop. The next morning, Ethan woke to an empty inbox and a sinking dread. Javier hadn't texted, hadn't called. Ethan paced his apartment, replaying the rooftop scene, cursing himself for letting his obsession show. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt hollow even in his head. Instead, he went to the garden, hoping to find Javier there, to fix things with a look or a touch. But Javier wasn't there. The plants, once vibrant, seemed to droop in sympathy. Days passed without contact. Ethan's world shrank to his apartment, his notebook, and the ache in his chest. He tried writing, but every line was about Javier, his strength, his absence. He'd see couples on the street and feel a pang, imagining Javier moving on, his muscles flexing for someone else. The thought was unbearable. He started leaving voicemails, each one more desperate. "I'm sorry, I just need to see you. Please, Javier, I can be better." No response. One night, driven by a mix of guilt and longing, Ethan went to Javier's apartment. The lights were off, but he knocked anyway, his heart hammering. When Javier opened the door, he looked tired, his usual warmth dimmed. "You can't just show up like this," he said, voice flat. Ethan begged to talk, and Javier let him in, more out of pity than desire. They sat on the couch, the space between them a chasm. "I don't know how to be what you want," Javier said. "You're not in love with me. You're in love with some idea of me." The words cut deep, but Ethan couldn't argue. He'd turned Javier into a fantasy, a collection of muscles and moments, not a person with flaws and fears. He apologized, tears falling, and Javier listened, his expression unreadable. "I need space," Javier said finally. "This is too much." Ethan left, the door clicking shut behind him like a final curtain. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and clarity. Ethan stopped going to the garden, unable to face the memories. He threw himself into his writing, channeling his obsession into a new play, a raw, messy story about love and its shadows. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt like he was creating something real. He started therapy, too, unpacking the insecurities that had fueled his fixation. It was hard, humbling work, but it gave him hope. One chilly October evening, Ethan went to a small theater in the East Village, where his play was being workshopped. It was a risk, exposing his heart to strangers, but he felt ready. As the actors read his lines, he saw his mistakes laid bare. The way he'd clung to Javier, the way he'd let love twist into something suffocating. The audience, small but attentive, clapped warmly at the end. Ethan exhaled, feeling a weight lift. Then he saw him, Javier, standing at the back of the theater, his face half lit by the exit sign. Ethan's heart lurched, but he didn't run to him. Instead, he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Javier nodded back, a faint smile on his lips, and slipped out before Ethan could say anything. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was enough to keep going. Months later, Ethan was different, not whole, but healing. His play had found a small following, and he was working on a new one, this time about redemption. He'd started volunteering at a different community garden in Harlem, finding peace in the dirt and the quiet. The obsession with Javier had faded, replaced by a quieter appreciation for what they'd shared. He still thought of him, but it was less about possession and more about gratitude. One spring morning, Ethan was planting marigolds when he heard a familiar laugh. His head snapped up, and there was Javier, helping a group of kids with a raised garden bed. He looked the same, strong, radiant, but there was a new ease to him, like he'd found his place. Ethan hesitated, then walked over. "Hey," he said, voice steady. Javier's eyes widened, then softened. "Hey, stranger," he replied, and they laughed, the sound light but real. They talked for a while, catching up like old friends. Javier was dating someone new, a teacher named Leo, and he seemed happy. Ethan shared about his play, his therapy, his growth. There was no bitterness, no longing. Just two people who'd once been everything to each other, now finding a new way to connect. Before they parted, Javier hugged him, brief but warm. "I'm proud of you," he said, and Ethan felt the words settle in his chest, a gift he hadn't expected. As Ethan walked home through the blooming streets of Harlem, he realized something. Love wasn't about owning someone or losing yourself in them. It was about seeing them, truly, and letting them see you. His obsession with Javier had been a storm, but it had led him here, to a place where he could breathe, create, and love without fear. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibility, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he belonged in it. His notebook was tucked under his arm, filled with new stories, new dreams. He didn't need to touch Javier's muscles to feel alive anymore. He was enough, just as he was.